Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi Shir.
Shalom Aleichem, welcome back to today's Daf Pesachim and Nun Aleph. We begin on Nun Amud Beis, 2 lines from the bottom. The Gemara is going to resume the conversation regarding the concept of minhag, which was introduced by the Mishnah, Mokim Shanagu. In fact, we concluded yesterday's Daf with the concept that even future generations are meant to maintain the minhag of their parents. Shema b'ni, Musar avicha, v'al titer sher semecha. Continues the Gemara. B'nei Chuzoi, the residents of Chuzoi, which was actually situated at a great distance from the center of Jewish life in Bavel. So there weren't such learned fellows, and they were concerned about the Kiyum HaMitzvahs. And for instance, when it came to Chala, we're going to see they established a big Chumrah in order to safeguard and secure the Kiyum, the observance of Mitzvahs Chala in their neighborhood. So Bnei Chuzoi Nagi, they had a minhag, the Mafreshi Chala Me'arayza. They separate Chala from a rice dough. We know only the 5 types of grain, the Chameshim Dogan, Chayv, and Chala, but not rice. And they had a minhag to be Mafresh Chala even from rice. Also, V'amru le Rav Yosef. So some individuals came and told Rav Yosef about this strange minhag. Amar Lewis, Rav Yosef responded, negate the minhag. Nechla zarba payu. A non-kohen should go ahead and eat that challah portion in their presence to demonstrate that it's not really challah, so it shouldn't lead to confusion and pitfall. Eis ve'abai. So Abai asked Rav Yosef, how could you be mevatel a minhag? A minhag amok? Dvarim hamutar v'acherim nogu b'nisr. Raisa says, if you have something which is mutar, but there are some people who were naig isser. Iyator rashoy latir mifneim. You have no right to be mater that minhag in their presence. Taisus points out, we're speaking not about a tos, a minhag tos, something which was based on just ignorance, a mistake. Rather, we're speaking about something which was established. They know that it's mutter, but they want to apply a chumrah, a safeguard, a shmirah on the din Torah, such as in this case where they wanted to be mafresh on oiris, in order to maintain in their town, to maintain the observance of proper challah when it comes to proper grain. So how could you, Rav Yosef, be mater this minhag? Amar Lois, Rav Yosef responded, I know the brayso, but that only applies in a specific case. V'lav mi'itmar Allah. Haven't we learned a pshat on that brayso? Amar Rav Chizda, because it's specific to kusim who are lax in their kiyum mitzvahs. And there's a concern if you're mater this, it's going to lead them to be mater other things. But ordinary people not. Ask the Gemara, what do you mean? Kusoi, my timer. Why do kusim have this unique status? Mishum the misruchi milsa, because one thing leads to the next. Hani inchinami, these fellows as well, who are not such tamid chachamim, sarchi milsa. It's going to lead to other kules. If you have mavatul their minhag when it comes to rice, people are going to stop being mekayim mitzvahs challah, even with respect to proper grains. So you can't be mavatul the minhag. Elam Ravashi, says Ravashi, it depends on the individual situation. Chazina, let's take a look. Let's take a closer look at this town. If most of them eat rice, that's their staple grain. In that case, a zar should not eat their challah. Because perhaps if you negate this minhag, the entire concept of challah will be forgotten in this town, because this is their staple food, their staple grain. If there's no challah here, they'll just give up the whole concept, and they won't realize to differentiate between grain and not a grain, and they won't do challah even when it comes to the chameshes minhag. So in this case, it pays to maintain this minhag. However, but if most of these people eat proper grain, in that case, it's just the opposite. It's better to eat. The zar should eat this challah, this rice challah, in their presence, to demonstrate to all that it's not a proper challah. Why? Why should you do that? Because otherwise, it might lead them to be mafresh challah from something which is chayv and challah, chameshes minei dogan, on something which is potter. They won't realize to differentiate between rice and wheat, or umin aptur al achiv, from something which is pater, for instance rice, on something which is chayiv. Well, Tosfos asks, how could you be mafresh from one on the other? In any case, you can't do that. So he says, we're speaking that it's a mixture. You have a rice and a wheat mixture, but let's say in one corner of this mixture you have more rice than wheat. So they won't realize to differentiate between rice and wheat. They'll think everything is chayiv and challah equally. So they'll take a large piece of dough which contains mostly rice, and really it's out of proportion because, let's say this dough is 50-50. So they're going to be moitzi. They're going to use rice to be moitzi, the wheat portion in this dough, and you can't do that. It's ptur, rice is pater minadin, on account of chiyuv. So according to Rav Ashi, you have to take a balanced approach. Judge the individual situation. What's going to bring more benefit? So if it's mostly rice in this town, let them have their minhag in order to maintain the concept of challah. If it's mostly other grains, then don't allow them to maintain their rice challah, because it's going to create confusion and pitfall. Perhaps when he goes and he makes a proper dough using proper grain, he might no longer differentiate and mix and match rice with wheat, which is a mechshel. So according to Rav Yosef, pointed out to them clearly, in any case, Abai responded, no, you're not meant to negate a minhag, which can lead to further kulas. Rav Ashi says, depends on the situation. What is more beneficial for the end result? Gufa, so we just learned a brisa, dvarim hamatarn, v'acherim nagu ben iser, iyator rashoy latir rifnei. So if they're no, you get an iser, on something which is technically mutter, you're meant to respect their minhag, don't be mattered. Omar of Chizah, b'kusoi atzkinan. This is referring to kusoi, kusim, who are not so diligent in their kiyum mitzvahs, and we don't want to allow, perhaps it's going to lead to more kulis. V'kuli amaloi, does this not apply to everyone else as well? Vatani, we learned in a brisa which seems to indicate that it does apply to other people as well, not just to kusim. The brisa says, Reichatzin shnei achin ke'echad. Min hadin, two brothers can go bathe together. There's no concern if they see each other undressed, it's going to lead to improper thoughts, or mishkav zachar, Rashi says. However, ve'in reichatzin shnei achin bekavel. In the town of Kavel, they were macham. Two brothers would not bathe together. In fact, there was a story, Umasa Rabbi Yehuda v'Hillel, banav shel Rabbi Gamliel. So Yehuda and Hillel, the sons of Rabbi Gamliel, sherachzu shneim ke'echad bekavel. They bathed together in this town of Kavel. Perhaps they didn't know that this was the minhag hamokim. V'la zu alein kol medina, and the whole town was in an uproar. What's going on? Amru, they said, mi'ameinu l're'inu kach. We never saw this type of behavior. V'nishmat Hillel. So one of the brothers, Hillel, slipped away, v'yotzo l'bayis hachitzon, to the exterior chamber of the merchatz, away from where you bathe. So he wanted to comply with the minhag hamokim, but he didn't want to. He didn't want to tell them that it's mutter, even though api halacha it's mutter. So he went along with the minhag. Another example is yotzim bekur the kisem b'Shabbos. This is a type of wide shoe which is a bit loose. A person technically can go into Shusram wearing this type of shoe. But in yotzim bekur the kisem b'Shabbos b'biri. In the town of Biri, they wouldn't wear this type of thing on Shabbos. They were concerned perhaps it's going to slip off. It might come to carry it for Amos and Shusarabim. And there was a story, Umas Rabbi Yehuda v'Hillel, banav shel Rabbi Gamliel, the same two brothers, sheyatzu bekur the kisan b'Shabbos b'Biri. So they walked down to the street in Biri wearing these shoes. V'laz alein hamdina, and the entire town was in an uproar. What's going on? V'amra, they said, v'yameinu l're'inu kach. We never saw this type of conduct. V'shamtim. So they complied. They didn't want to contravene the minhag, and they removed him from their feet. V'nosnum lavdeim, and they handed it to their servants. So they wanted to comply with the minhag. And the Fe'anaim asks, even a person's servant is meant to refrain from malachas. How can they give it to the evidence? He says, perhaps here it's not a din, it's not an isser, it's just on account of maris ayin. So it doesn't negate the minhag hamokim. So they took it off, but they handed it to the evidence. But they didn't want to nullify the minhag in their presence and say, well, it's mutter. So once again, we see that even when it comes to ordinary people, not kusim, people of biri, ordinary Yisraelim, we're not meant to be mad to their isser. A third example, v'yoishvin al safsalei nachem b'Shabbos. Min hadin, you may sit together with the goyim there on their benches, even though they're engaged in commerce and sale on Shabbos. It wouldn't appear like he's involved in Mekach HaMemker. Ve'eino yoishvin al safsalei nachem b'Shabbos ba'akay. In Akay they had a minhag. And no, you don't sit on these benches. It looks like you're involved in business activities on Shabbos. Umasa, but Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, sheyashav al safsalei nachem b'Shabbos ba'akay. He sat down on one of these benches in Akay. V'lo zolav kol Medina, and the whole town was talking about it. Amro, they said, mi'ameinu l're'inu kach. We never saw this type of conduct. So he complied. V'nishmat v'yashav al gabi karka. So he slipped off and sat on the floor. V'leirotz aloim l'em b'torin atam. He didn't want to tell them that really it's something which is mutter. So apparently, not only kusim has his halacha, has his concern. Any person, you're not meant to negate his minhag. Says the Gemara, B'nei Medinas Hayam Nami. This applies not only to kusim, but also to B'nei Medinas Hayam, who live in towns which are situated at a distance from the center of Jewish life. There as well, there's a concern. If you go and negate the minhag, they're not telling the Chachamim, they'll start drawing parallels and say, well, if this is mutter and the other thing is mutter, and it's going to create a mikshul. B'nei Medina Sayam Nami, these fellows living in these outlying towns, since the Chachamim don't frequent, the towns are not frequented by Chachamim, Kekusam Damu. In this respect, they have the same halacha as the Kusim, and therefore must be careful not to go ahead and create a wrong impression. Okay, so this halacha applies not only to Kusim, also to B'nei Medina Sayam. Now let's analyze. We have 3 examples, 3 minhagim, 3 chumras. What is the basis? What was the reasoning behind these chumras? It has to have some sort of pshat. Bishloim esafsali nochrim. We understand the reason to refrain from sitting on the benches of the goyim, which were places where they engaged in buying and selling. It looks like he's engaged in commerce on Shabbos. Bekur the kisanami. There as well, there's a concern with the wide shoes. Dilma mishtalf, and perhaps a slip off. Asay lisa yinu arba amayis b'shus ram. And he might come to carry it for amayis b'shus ram. Ela reichsen, my time of life. But what's wrong with 2 brothers bathing together? Says the Mark of the Sanya, as we learned in the Bryce. Im hakoil adam reichetz. A person may bathe in the same merchatz with anybody's company. Chutz mi'aviv, except for with his father, v'chamev, his father-in-law, ubal imay, the husband of his mother, stepfather, ubal achaisai, and the husband of his sister's brother-in-law. As Rashi will explain for us, there's concern about generating inappropriate feelings, inappropriate thoughts. Rabbi Yehuda Mata b'aviv. He says when it comes to a son with his father, that's okay. We play covet aviv on account of the covet of his father, so that he can serve his father. Apparently, Rabbi Yehuda holds that the mitzvah will protect him. He's engaged in kibbutz. Fourth in lebal imay, same thing applies to a stepfather. So this is min hadin. Anybody except father, father-in-law, etc. Va'asu inu. Now the residents of Kaval added a chumrah. The Gazer, they applied Gzeir and Isser, B'shnei Achen, with 2 brothers, Mishum Ba'al HaChaisei, on account of his brother-in-law. If he without 2 brothers, perhaps it's going to lead him to do the same with his brother-in-law, which is us. So this was the background, this was the basis of their chumrah. Tana, we learned in the Brisa, Talmud lo yichatzim rabbi. Likewise, a Talmud should not bathe with his Rebbe. As Rashi explains here, it's a covered issue. He's meant to respect your Rebbe and have fear. So refrain from this type of conduct. However, v'im rabbi tzorach lemut, if his Rebbe needs him to serve him in the merchatz, in this case it's mutter. It's not considered a negation of his covet. Perhaps let's take a look at Rashi. Rashi here would begin 8 lines from the top of the Amud. Reichatzin Shnei Achim Ke'echad. The Brisa says that two brothers can be in a merchatz at the same time. Ve'ein kan mishum pritzes. It's not considered appropriate. The name of mishum mitzuyin yachad. That we should perhaps speculate since they're found together. V'achshav roin arum zeh zeh. See each other in dress. Nice ish ayin ish ba'achiv. Lishko zachar can create improper feelings and thoughts and can lead to avir. We're not concerned. However, ve'ein roichatzin. K'loim ein noyegim. Shnei Achim lichutz ke'echad b'kavel b'makom. In this makom kavel, they would have this chumrah. Even two brothers wouldn't join each other in the merchatz. So that was the chumrah in kavel. What about the chumrah in biri? That was regarding the kurd kisen, ashkepunshe, ruchavim, these wide shoes or slippers. We're not concerned. Dilma mishtalfe v'asi. Perhaps they'll slip off, and he might go v'asi l'sanyun and carry them. Abams shesrab. Ve'ein derech bnei biri, however, losis b'kurd kisen. Minadin, you can do it, but in biri, they had a minute to refrain. Shehein noyegen ben is. What was the third thing, which was the minig in Akoy, regarding Sapsali Nachram? So Minadin, one can sit on the Goyish benches, Shein Moichem and Schreira, with engaged in selling and buying, L'chashin L'chashtad. I'm concerned that a person will suspect him of being involved in business activities on Shabbos. However, in Akoy, they had a minig to be Machram. Proceeded with the Brisa, that a person can join anybody in the Merchatz except for Aviv v'Chamiv. Why? When he notices him, and he recalls that he came out from his father, can generate improper feelings. The same with his father-in-law. He pays attention. He's nice and leiv. That his wife came from there. Same thing with his brother-in-law, can generate improper thoughts. However, says the Gemara, this is Rabbi Yehuda speaking, that when it comes to a father, you're allowed to. Mishum kavod aviv, shemisham shebemerchatz. So this has been adit. However, in kavel they were machmer, v'asa inu b'nei kavel, and they said, well, even two brothers, because it can lead to a brother-in-law as well. We had a brisa which said that a talmid liyirchatz im rabbi shetzarach lesbayish mikvoidim u'iroi, meant to have shame and kavod and yira. V'imhay rabbi tzarach lo shem shemshenim b'merchatz, then he's allowed to join him in the merchatz. Continues the Gemara. Ki also Rabba Bar Bachana, when Rabba Bar Bachana arrived from Babel to Eretz Yisrael, from Eretz Yisrael to Babel, Ochal de'ayatra, he ate a certain type of chalev called ayatra. So this chalev is found on the stomach of the animal, the keva, which is a semicircle shaped organ, like a banana, and there are two portions of chalev on this keva. There's the akashta, because it looks like a bone, it looks like an arrow, like a bow, right? It's a semicircle, and there's actually like a bowstring going from one side to the other. So the chela found on the semicircle portion is called the akashta, like keshes. The chela found on the flat part is called the ayatra. Yeter means a string, a bowstring. So there was a machlekes between the Bnei Eretz Yisrael, who only considered the akashta chelav to be asur, whereas the ayatra chelav, the one on the flat portion, the bowstring, was not considered to be chelav asur. Whereas the Bnei Bavel, they held that the ayatra as well is considered to be asur. So what happened? Rabbi Bar Chana arrived to Bavel from Eretz Yisrael. Achal de ayatra. So he sat down and he ate the ayatra chelav, because according to the Bnei Yisrael, it's mutter. Oil legabei Rav Avira Saba v'Rabba Breda Ravuna. So these two came to visit Rabbi Rachana. Kivan the Chazino, as soon as he noticed them, kasi minai, he concealed the chalev. He didn't want them to see it. Also v'Amar LaAbaye. So they came to Abaye and they related to him the story. Look, we entered the house and look, he hid it from us. Amar lahu. So he told them, Shavinchu kikutai. Apparently he regarded you like kusim. When it comes to a kusi, not meant to be mater, his minig, his isser, so he regarded you like a kusi, and therefore, even though he himself considered it to be mutter, but he didn't want to be mater, to conduct himself in a heter manner in your presence, for concern that it might lead to other isurim. You're like a kusi. Now Marshal points out this wasn't an insult, but actually a compliment. that due to his high regard for your intellectual abilities and make pilpulim and Torah, he was concerned if you see him, that if you see him eating this ayatra, you might go ahead and draw parallels, maybe to other things as well. Says the Gemara, okay, so he didn't want to do it in their presence, but we have another concern. We learned in the Mishnah. When a person travels from one location to the other, he needs to adopt both the chumrah of his native town and the chumrah of his current location. So, fine, in public, he didn't negate the minhag, but he himself, how could he eat it? He meant to adopt the chumrah of the current location, which is Babel, where they refrained from eating the chel of dayatra. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Bar Bachana, Leslie Hadesnan, does he not hold of the Mishnah? Noisen olav chumrei hamakam sheyatza misham, v'chumrei hamakam shalach l'sham. A traveler is meant to adopt a chumrah on both accounts, his former location and his current location. Amar Abai, hanamili mi Bavel leBavel. It only applies within Bavel. If he's traveling from one city to the other within Bavel, then you have to adopt the minhag hamakam. Eretz Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, or between two towns in Eretz Yisrael. Inami, or mi Bavel, Eretz Yisrael. So in these three scenarios, we apply the concept of the minhag hamakam. Aval, Eretz Yisrael, a Bavel way. But if a person travels from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, such as Rabbi Bar Bachana, there's no concern. You don't have to comply with the minhag hamakam. Why? Kivan de anan kafina lahu, because since the Bnei Bavel are subordinate, a kafaf, to the Bnei Yisrael, Rashi explains that the halachic authority in Yisrael was of a much higher standing. In Yisrael they had smicha, they would engage in applying knas, kiddush hachodesh, ibrash shana. So the Bnei Yisrael were much higher in their position of authority, halachic authority. So the Bnei Bavel considered to be kafaf to them, subordinate to them. And if that's the case, avdina kavasayu. So we can do like that, meaning if a person arrives from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he doesn't have to reckon with the minhag hamakam. Rashi explains it's not going to generate machloikis in any way, because they'll recognize the high authority of the person coming from Eretz Yisrael. And that explains why Rabbi Bachana was not sensitive to minhag hamakam. He was not concerned about generating machlekes. That's one shot. Rav Ashi Amar afilu tema Eretz Yisrael leBavel. Even if we're speaking from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, and even then you have to adopt the minhag hamakam. So even if the halacha in the Mishnah applies to Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, that's only hanamili heicha de'ein data lachzor. When a person has no intention of returning to his former location, former town, then you have to adopt minhag hamakam. However, Rabbi Bachana was planning going back home. Therefore, he wasn't bound to the minhag of Bavel. Let's see Rashi inside. So it's towards the middle, actually a bit under the middle of the Amud, which is exactly 22 lines from the bottom. So Rashi begins with the words Ochal de Yatra. This was Rabbi Bar Bachana. He ate the chelav of the ayatra. Explains Rashi. Chelav shebekfifas hakeva. That's the chelav which is inside the bent portion of the stomach. Shakefa kfufa vasuike keshes. It's bent and shaped like a bow. Va'oisei chelav shebemakam hayeter. The chelav which is at the location of the bowstring. Oichlam bnei Eretz Yisrael. So in Yisrael they would eat it. Bnei Bavel noigam be'isra. They had a minhag that was asr. So he ate it, but then he hid it when his guests arrived. Sabai told them, Shavin chuke kusoi. He treated you like kusam. Dabrin alel, we said earlier. Devarim hamatarim, v'achirim noigam ben isra. Iata rashai, latirim b'fneim, v'ukram chizim kusoi. He applied this to kusam. Well, then the Gemara had another kasha. How could he himself be mekel? Aren't you meant to adopt the minhag hamakam? The Gemara said, depends. Hanamilu mi Bavel leBavel. Within Bavel, Mir le'ir beBavel. The kivan to localfile adad. Since each town functions independently, it's not that one is connected or kafaf to the other. If he's going to deviate from their minhag in their presence, it can lead to machlekes. V'kolshkin mi Bavel Eretz Yisrael. Al Yishana, certainly when he's from Babel to Eretz Yisrael, he shouldn't be Meshana. Al Yishana is Minhag HaMokim, Pnei Machlekes. Abel Eretz Yisrael, Babel, over there there's no concern. In Yishana, it's Haminhag Babel, Ein Ka Machlekes. Why? Danan Kafinu Bnei Yisrael, we're kafaf to the Bnei Yisrael. The Inu Smich, they have Smicha, Babel is Smichi. So their authority stands higher. And we respect their halachas, and it won't create discord. Avdina Kavasai, so in that case we say we follow them. Kalema, in boy Misham Lukan, if they come from Eretz Yisrael to Babel, Ein Lam L'shanas Minhagim, there's no need for them to change their minhag hamokim. They maintain their minhag, Eloisim Kim Kaiman, and they don't have to follow our minhag hamokim. The Gemara gave us another teretz. I feel the Eretz Yisrael to Babel al Yishana. Even if a person is traveling from Eretz Yisrael to Babel, cannot be Mishana. However, when he's date lachsa, a person intends on returning back home, in which case he's not bound, he's not committed to the minhag of his current location, and that was a pshat in Rabba Bar Chana. So in conclusion, the Mishnah tells us that a person must follow the Chumrei HaMokim, his current location. The Gemara tells us, well, that only applies within Babel, within Eretz Yisrael, from Babel to Eretz Yisrael. However, from Eretz Yisrael to Babel, because Yisrael stands higher in halacha, there's no need to adopt the new minhag hamokim. According to the second teretz, if he's date lachsa, intends on returning, he's not bound to his current location. And Tosfos adds another thing. This whole din of being committed to your current minhag, your current location, is only if it's a minhag chashav, which was established by Talmid Chachamim. But if it's just something which was grassroots minhag, it wasn't something that was a chashav minhag established by Talmid Chachamim, it doesn't bind. It's not binding upon the guest, the visitor. Now Tosfos has another kasha. He says if date lachsa is a factor, so if you intend on returning, then you belong in your old town. If you intend on staying here, then you're bound by the minhag hamokim. How do you understand the Mishnah? Mishnah says a traveler gets both chumras, the chumrah of the minhag hamokim of the town that he left, and the town to which he arrived. Chumrah hamokim sheyatz misham, chumrah hamokim shehalach lasham. Says Tosfos, how can you ever have both things? Memanav shech. If it's date lachser, intends on returning to his hometown, then he's only bound to that halacha, not bound to the local minhag. If he intends on remaining, then this is a new town, so he gets the minhag hamokim, not the old minhag. So when could you have both at once? Tosfos says you're right. The Mishnah is referring to two separate cases. When the Mishnah says you adopt the chumrah of the local area, that's in the case where he's settled here. He has no intention of returning. When the Mishnah says you get the chumrah of your former town, that's when it's date lachs. In which case you don't have to adopt the chumrei hamokim shalach lasham, his current location. The Ran, however, says that the Mishnah is speaking in both cases where he intends on returning home, but says the Ran, although halachically he's really not bound to the local minhag because he's not a local resident. However, b'pnei hamachlekes, to avoid the machlekes, he's meant to conform, at least publicly, with our hesya. Don't deviate from the minhag hamokim. Although b'tzina, privately, he can do what he wants because he's not bound because he intends on returning home. He's considered to be as though he's back home. That's the Tosfos and the Ran. Continues the Gemara. Amalei Rabba Bar Chana Livnei. So Rabba Bar Chana told his son, Bni, my son, loy toicha. You shouldn't eat, going back to the chelav de ayatra, the bowstring chelav, you shouldn't be eating this. Loy befanai, v'loy shaloi befanai. Not in my presence, and certainly not shaloi befanai, not in my presence. Why? Although I ate, you shouldn't be eating this. I myself, who observed Rabbi Yehuda, who was a very high authority, I saw him eat, so I followed suit. Kedayu Rabbi Yehuda lismechalav b'fanav v'shloi b'fanav. So I can follow that, whether in his presence or even not in his presence. Perhaps since he did it in front of me, he didn't care that I saw him. Apparently, he was conveying to me that this is the halach. You should actually follow, you can actually keep this halach. You can also eat this chelav. So I got that permission from him. I got that psak from him. Although I myself am not a sufficient authority to actually conclude that this is the proper pshat. This is the proper halacha. But I followed Rabbi Yechon's halacha. I'm relying on him because I observed him doing it. He did it in my presence. He allowed me to follow this halacha. So I can do it for the rest of my life, whether he's here or not. That's with respect to myself. However, since it's not my psak, I can't convey to others. I can't rule on this matter and convey that heta to others because it's not my conclusion. It's not my psak. It's not my personal understanding of the halacha. It's simply that I'm relying on Rabbi Yehuda. If that's the case, you, my son, you can't. You shouldn't be eating this ayatra. Don't rely on me. Ata lo ru'isa isai. Since you didn't observe Rabbi Yehuda, lo yisaychal, you shouldn't be eating. Bein mefanai, whether even in my presence. Bein shlei mefanai, certainly not in my presence. It's an interesting concept. That the father can eat and the son can't, because the father was granted that allowance by Rabbi Yehuda. He had the psak to rely on. But since it's not his own personal understanding, it's not his own personal conclusion, and he can't convey that to others. Apparently, Rabbi Bachana himself is in dispute of his own statement stated elsewhere. The Amar Rabbi Bachana. Here we're going to find that he did allow another person to eat something, at least in his presence, because since he had the heter from his Rebbe, so somebody else can go ahead and join him, so to speak, have it in his presence, as though he's doing it together with him. That much it. Shaloi b'fanav, if it's not in his presence, yeah, the other person can't do it. But in the presence of the Talmud, who himself conducts himself derech heter, that's okay. The Amar Rabbi Chana, Sachli Rabbi Yochanan ben Elazar. Rabbi Yochanan ben Elazar conveyed to me the following story. Pamachas nechnasti. There was once an incident that I followed. Achar Rabbi Shimon ben Rabbi Yosi ben Lekunya Legina. I followed him into a garden. This was on Shemitah. V'notal sfichei kruv v'achal. And he took a cabbage. So sfichin means something which is an aftergrowth. It wasn't actually planted, but grew from the seeds which had been dropped from the previous year's crop. So that's a sfiach, sfichei, sfichin. So he grabbed the, this was Rabbi Shimon ben Rabbi Yosi ben Lekunya. He took a hold of this sfichei kruv, and he ate it, va'achal v'nosali, and he actually handed one to me as well, va'amarli, and he told me like this, B'ni, my son, b'fanai echad, you can eat in my presence. Shaloi b'fanai lo yisayich, but not in my presence. If you're not here, if I'm not here, then you cannot eat this type of cabbage. Now what are we speaking about? So Rashi learns, this was on the Shemitah year, but after the Zman Bir. So there's no more produce left out in the field for the animals. Torah says that a person has to do Bir, has to go and remove it from his possession, like Bir Chametz. You can no longer eat it, you have to put it outside. So we're speaking that it was already after the Zman Bir, there were no longer any cabbages available, but still, he went ahead and he ate it. Not only did he eat it, he handed it to the Talmud, and he said, you can eat it, as long as it's in my presence. But Shaloi b'fanai you can't. Why? So he explained, Ani shari'isi, es Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai she'achal, I myself, who actually observed Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai eating such a cabbage, under such circumstances, because he held that even after the cabbage is no longer present out in the field, but the roots of the cabbage are still embedded in the ground, and that's enough to allow a person to eat cabbage. It's still, the supply is still available. So that was his sheet. So I saw Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai conduct himself in this manner, eating the cabbage. So I rely on him. Kedayu, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, lismach alav, b'fanav, v'shloi b'fanav. He's worthy to be relied upon, whether in his presence or even shaloi b'fanav. I received that allowance from him, although I myself don't have the ability. Rashi says that he's not a bar samcha. He doesn't have the halachic ability, the authority to go ahead and rule on such a matter. because it was actually machlokes, Shimon and Chachamim. But since I saw him doing it, if a person sees the Adam Gadol doing it, his Rebbe, he can follow suit. Again, the point is the Rebbe did it in his presence, perhaps to indicate, yeah, I allow you to do this. I'm giving you this halacha. So once you get that psak, you can do it throughout your lifetime, whether it's b'fanav or shloi b'fanav. However, you're limited. Ata, you who haven't observed personally, you never saw Shimon Rechai conduct himself in this manner. You're seeing me, a Talmud, doing it. So yeah, you can do it with me. Ata b'fana echal. In front of me you can eat. It's as though he's doing it together with him. He's joining him. So since this act is mutter, right, the Talmud can do it, right, because he saw his Rebbe. So when his Talmud follows and does it in front of him, it's as though he's doing it together with the Rebbe, who himself can do it. It's going to be one and the same act, one and the same mice. However, shaloi b'fanei, but if it's not in my presence, lo yachal, you can't. Lo yisaychal, you can't eat. So who conveyed this whole incident? It was Rabbi Bar Chana, which indicates that when a person is mekabel a halacha from the Rebbe, so although there's a dispute, there's a machlekes, and the Talmud doesn't have the ability to really paskin, but when he receives the allowance from the Rebbe, it applies not only to himself personally, but even to somebody else who's going to conduct himself in that manner in his presence. Because as though he's doing it together with the Talmud, who himself has an allowance. There's a heter throughout. That's in the second story, in contrast to the first. Rabbi Bar Chana, who told his own son, I can eat the ayatra, because I saw Rabbi Yochanan, but you must refrain, even in my presence. So apparently there's no allowance, even in his presence. We don't say that when it's in his presence, it's considered like doing it together with him. We don't say that, we don't apply that svara. Says the Gemara, what's going on with the Svichei Kruv? My Rabbi Shimon, where do we find Rabbi Shimon Rechai, who allows the cabbage? The Sanya. Rabbi Shimon Omer. So the stand of Shimon in the Mishnah, the Brayse says Rabbi Shimon Rechai. So he says like this: Kol ha-svichin asur. Certainly all the other svichim are asur. So once it's post the beer time, is no longer a supply in the field, you can no longer eat the aftergrowths. Chutz misvichei kruv, except for svichei kruv. She'ein kayotze behen, beer kasada, because they're unique. There's nothing like them in the garden and the vegetables out there. As we explained, because the kruv plant has some roots in the ground. So even after the visible portion has been removed, there's still some roots remaining, and that's considered part of the cabbage. As long as that remains in the ground, it's considered to be available, a supply available for the animals, and there's no din to do beer. The Chacham, I don't know, kol ha-svichin asur. All svichim, including cabbage, once supply has been depleted, they're asur. So cabbage has the same thing like other vegetables. Whenever the other vegetables have been depleted, cabbage goes along with the same halacha. We don't reckon with the roots. One will tell us it's a gzeira, because if we allow this, perhaps a person won't notice, won't realize why we are being matir, and is going to come to allow other vegetables as well, even after the supply has been completely depleted. Says about Tavayu, I'll leave with Rabbi Kiva. Both Rabbi Shimon and Rabbanan are based on Rabbi Kiva. The Sanya, Heimli Nizra, so the pasuk says, describing Yisrael going to say how we're going to have what to eat on Shemitah. Look, we can't plant and we can't gather our crops. Oh, Rabbi Kiva, why the repetition? If you're not going to plant, certainly you won't gather. If they're not going to plant, how can they harvest? So what's the point of the pasuk? The pasuk is coming to add something. A, you're not allowed to plant. Number two, you can't even harvest something which grew on its own. Mikan l'svichim shein asurim. So these svichim can't be gathered, and according to Rashi's Pshat, we're speaking after the Zman Bir. So this is the background. Okay, so what's the Pshat in the Machlekes? Rabbi Shimon, who says the cabbage is mutter, Rabbanan say it's asa. Rabbanan savri gazrina and svichei kruv. Atu shvar svichei dam. Although the svichei kruv still have some roots in the ground, in which case the supply is still considered there and available. But perhaps if a person will eat this, he'll eat other vegetables as well, even after supply has been depleted. He won't realize that there's some roots in the ground. Rav Shimon Samer, no, we don't have this gzeira, svichei kruv, at svichei d'alma, and therefore he holds it's mutter to eat this cabbage. That's Rashi's Pshat. Taisus disagrees. He has many Kashas and Rashi, he learns like this, that the concept of sfichen is all-encompassing. Any aftergrowth. For instance, a vegetable which grows on its own on Shemitah is really awesome. Whether in Torah, whether in the Rabbanon, different approaches. So he learns that Rabbi Shimon was mater sfichei kruv. Why? Because it only applies to something which is like a zera, a zriya, but not a tree. And he says Rabbi Shimon regarded cabbage like a tree. Therefore, it doesn't have the isser of sfichen. Where the Rabbanan said no, they made a gzera, therefore allow this, well, it's going to allow other vegetables, and therefore anything that grows on the Shemitah year is us. Any sfichim, any type of zera, any type of plant would be considered sfichin and is us. So what the Taisus doesn't relate to beer concept. It has nothing to do with the zman beer. It's just the general halach that anything that constitutes zera or vegetables which grows even on its own on the Shemitah year as a result of last year's seeds that fell, etc. So this type of aftergrowth is asur. This one from the pasuk that the sfichin are asur, and he says there's another pshat that's always rabbanon, and that's the background of our Gemara. Continues the Gemara, hoylech makam v'chulu. So Mishnah tells us that if a person is a traveler from one place to the other, you follow the chumrah of both the former and current locations, and the Mishnah concludes, Val yishana adam v'pnei machlekes. The person should not be mishana from the minhag hamokim, not to create machlekes. So first, the Mishnah had a case where he came from a place which does malacha on Erev Pesach, and he arrived at a city where they don't do malacha. And then in the second case, he came from a location where they do malacha, where they don't do malacha, and arrived in a place where they do malacha. Says the Gemara, what does the Mishnah mean, al yishana adam b'pnei machlekes? Bishlam, we understand that in the first case this would apply. If he came from a place where they do malacha Erev Pesach, and he arrives l'makom she'einois, okay? So nois and olav chumrei makom shal chasham. In this case, we apply the chumrah of the minhag hamokim, refrain from malacha, and the Mishnah explains itself. Val yishana adam b'pnei machlekes. He shouldn't be mashana because it can create machlekes. Everybody else is idle, refraining from malacha, and he is engaged in malacha. That explains the halacha. And he shouldn't engage in malach. So that's understood. But regarding the second case in the Mishnah, he came from a place where they don't do malach, and he arrived l'makom she'os. Mishnah says that he's meant to do the chumrah, the minhag of his formal town, refrain from malacha. But then the Mishnah continues, Al Yeshana Adam B'pnei Machlekes. But he shouldn't be Meshana from the minhag hamokim. It seems to be a contradiction. You're saying, do the chumrah of your former location, refrain from malacha. And now you're saying, no, but don't deviate. What is the minhag hamokim? They do malacha. So v'na'avid. So this person should also do malacha. Ha'amras, didn't you just tell me? Noisen olav chumrei makom shal chasham. V'chumrei makom sheyatsa misham. We apply both chumras. The chumrah of your current town and your former town. So how can the Mishnah say a person should never be meshana from his minhag hamokim? In the first case, we came from a place that they do malacha, arrived in a town where they don't do malacha. So we understand. We apply the chumrah of his current location, and the Mishnah continues, don't be meshana because of machlekes. So for instance, even if we're speaking that he's da'at lachsa, he intends on returning to his former town. As we explained earlier, that doesn't obligate him any longer. He's not bound by the minhag hamokim, but still, don't be meshana, don't do mulacha, because don't create machlekes. So your current place, they don't do mulacha, keep it as such, refrain from mulacha. That's good. But how does this phrase, al yishana adam b'pnei machlekes, apply to the second case? He came from a place where they don't do mulacha. He arrived at a town where they do malacha, and you tell me, don't be meshana. Follow suit. Do the minhag hamokim and do malacha. Well, you meant to be bound by your former town, which is a place which doesn't do malacha. Amar Abaye Aresha. You're right. this phrase, Alishan Adam V'pnei Machlekes, never deviate from Minhag HaMakom, is only referring to the first halacha in the Mishnah, the Reisha. So he came from a town where they do malacha. He arrived at a place where they don't do malacha. Refrain from doing malacha. Don't generate machlekes. So according to Abaye, it only refers to the first clause in the Mishnah. Rav Amar no, lo ilam ha-seifa. Certainly it's referring to the second case as well. He came from a town where they don't do malacha. Arriving in a location where they do malacha. This is what the Mishnah means to say. We're telling you the chumrah of your former town applies. And although in your current location they do malacha, you refrain. What about machlekes? The fact that you're deviating, you're doing your own thing. Everyone's doing malacha and you're sitting idle. Isn't that going to create machlekes? This behavior, refraining from malacha, doesn't entail a shina, a deviation, ha-machlekes, which can generate machlekes. Why? Maika amris. Well, what do you mean to say? What's your concern? Haroya Imer, the observer will say, why are you refraining from malacha? Malacha asura. I'll say, well, apparently he holds that it's asur. That's going to create machlekes. No, there's no concern. You know why? Because you're simply being inactive. You're not actively negating the minhag HaMakom. You're sitting idle. Meimar, Amar, Amri. People will just say, look, he has nothing to do. Kama batlan, he's not the first one that's sitting idle. Look how many batlanim are sitting out in the shuk. So he simply doesn't have what to do. He has no work today. That explains the halacha. How is it that a person who came from a place where they don't do malacha and arrived in a place where they do malacha, that he can adopt the chumrah of his former location and refrain from malacha? What about machlekes? So according to Rava's Pshat, explains the Rush, on account of machlekes, on account of keeping the peace and harmony, it would seem that a person can even negate his chumrah of his former location. It overrides the sholem factor, overrides the din that a person is meant to maintain the chumrah of his former location, of his native town. And that's a pshat in the Mishnah. Why is no machlekes concerned if he's going to maintain his chumrah and refrain from malacha? The answer is because it's not obvious. People will say, look, he's sitting idle, there's nothing better to do. And therefore there's no concern of machlekes in this case. So according to Abaye, this phrase, pnei machlekes, only applies to the first case in the Mishnah. So he's coming from a place where they do, arrived at a place where they don't. You also don't, because of machlekes. According to Rabbi, it applies in both cases. And it's come to explain the halacha, and also the halacha where he's refraining from halacha on account of his former town. What about machlekes? There's no concern because it's not something which is an obvious negation of the minhag HaMakom. Okay, let's review today's daf. Our daf primarily involved itself with discussion regarding minhag HaMakom, and we learned the chiddush that if we have some people who adopted a minhag, and Tosfos explains it's not just a minhag tos, it was something which they consciously adopted and established, we're not meant to negate that minhag. The Gemara says this applies strictly where there's a concern that it might lead to other kulos, for instance to the kusim, or people that are living in outlying towns who are not so learned. Now what about the halacha that a person is meant to adopt the chumrah of his current location? The Gemara says this halacha comes with 3 exceptions. It doesn't apply to a person who travels from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel. Because the second pshat in the Gemara, if he's datei lachs, intends on returning back home, then he's not bound by the halacha, the chumrah of his current location. And also Tosfos points out, this only applies to a minyan chashiv, which was established by Talmidei Chachamim. However, says the Ran, in a case where he intends on returning back home, where he's not bound by the minhag HaMakom, but that's only to the point of being matir to do it b'tzina, privately, but don't do it in public, which will generate machlekes. Indeed, as the Gemara concluded, that machlekes is a very important factor. In fact, Rava would seem to allow the person to actually do something which is overriding his chumrah of the makam where he came from because of the machlekes factor. And that's what the Mishnah has to take pains to explain why it doesn't apply in this case, because it's not going to be machlekes. They see him sitting idle, and they just attribute it to lack of interest or lack of activity. And we also learned about the concept of svichen, and about the heter of b'fanav and shaloi b'fanav. Be well, and Hatzlacha Rabbah.